Today we have invited Dr. Michael Chrostowski, and he is the CEO and founder of Sound Options. And for people who suffer from something called tinnitus, you're a really big deal because you have a whole new solution that you have created. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've been up to?
Yeah, so with Sound Options, we provide people with this constant ringing, hissing, or buzzing in the ears with a way to try to manage and reduce that over time. So basically we work with hearing clinics, and we provide people with this customized sound therapy that they can listen to so that over time that ringing or the buzzing that they might hear will get reduced, become more manageable, improve their sleep and things like that.
So I was telling a few people about some of the people we were interviewing this week, and one of the main questions is tinnitus or tinnitus? Can you solve the mystery? What am I supposed to be saying?
To be honest, it might vary based on where you are. So in the US, people might say tinnitus more so. In Canada and in Great Britain, places like that, tinnitus seems to be more popular. But you'll see tinnitus in other places as well. And to be honest, I think I've switched over to tinnitus over time, whereas I used to say tinnitus. So I don't know if I can solve the mystery, but yeah. It's
tomato, tomato.
That's right, tomato, tomato.
Okay. So for those who don't understand it, we touched on it a little bit, but can you tell me a little bit more about how it affects a person in their day-to-day and what the range is?
Yeah, so tinnitus can vary quite a bit from person to person, not just in kind of what the sound is and whether it's like a tone or a hiss. It can also vary in terms of how loud it is and how much it bothers a person. So for some people, it's kind of like a background noise. It may have been there for a while. For others, it is a nuisance. So sometimes they really need to distract themselves to try to get it in the background. But when they're going to bed and things like that, it can be disruptive. Or when they're trying to relax or read a book, times like that. And then there are people where it's a lot more severe. It's very difficult for them to find ways to get it out of their head or into the background, and it can be very severe. There have been some pretty kind of tragic circumstances for certain people with severe tinnitus, as serious as suicide. But in other cases, there are things like anxiety and depression as well that can develop. When someone has something that is so bothersome to them, but other people around may not even know that they have it or may not appreciate it. It not only affects them every day, but they also might feel a little bit isolated because of that, and it kind of wears away at them over time, and it's definitely a big problem for those people.
When you're talking to patients who have worked with you and have found treatment this way, what are some of those stories of relief that you hear? For all the reasons you're saying, like when you have something that people can see outwardly that affects you, your physical nature or something, there tends to be more sympathy. When there's something that people don't understand or can't really see or hear, they're in this gray area, and it's very profound for them, but could be sort of dismissed by everyone else.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem too. A lot of people will have it, and they may have found that it hasn't been taken as seriously. They may have even gone to their doctor, and possibly a common phrase that they hear is, "You got to learn to live with it. There's nothing that can be done," and so people kind of feel like they're on their own in that case. So their experience will end up being one where they deal with something on a regular basis, and if it is very serious, it'll start kind of encroaching on aspects of their life. So I've heard of people saying they had to take time off work before. They'd wake up in the middle of the night and they'd feel that this sound woke them up, and so after using a treatment for it, they will say that they feel, and this is a key thing, they feel like they have more control over their life and over the condition, so they no longer feel as helpless. And they'll start to feel that their sleep has improved. So they kind of have more energy getting up, and they won't feel as frustrated. And the thing with tinnitus is things like stress and anxiety and frustration, it can sometimes feed into it. It can even make it feel like it's louder. And so when people feel they have more of that control, maybe they do find that it's getting quieter over time with the treatment, but also they have a tool to use. It kind of helps break that negative feedback loop that may be interfering with a way to deal and cope with that tinnitus as well. So I've heard stories from people saying that, whereas before they felt very desperate and they felt like they were kind of at the end of the rope, now they have a sense of hope, and they know they're committing to something, but they see results and they see benefits, and so it just gives them a more positive outlook, as well as just in general kind of reducing the volume of this constant hiss or buzzing that they've been hearing.
So something called sound therapy kind of sounds beautifully abstract to me. Can you help me understand what exactly is going on, what you've developed, and what it's doing?
Sure. So with the reason we look at something like sound therapy is tinnitus is fundamentally something that's involved with your hearing brain or your auditory brain. And in most cases, there can be different causes for it. Most often it is hearing loss or hearing damage. But it's thought that what happens is the hearing brain will try to compensate for something. Let's say it is hearing damage. And as it does, different things can change in your brain. So your brain can become kind of hyper-excitable in terms of your hearing brain. And it can start, like the brain cells can start firing at the same time. And usually that would only happen if you're perceiving a sound. But now if they're firing on their own, you'll end up hearing a sound even though nothing outside or external is causing it. So with the sound therapy, like the one from Sound Options, what we try to do is we try to understand what kind of brain changes could have occurred to contribute to that person's tinnitus. How did it develop? What kind of specific changes could have happened? And then this will happen through these kind of mechanisms in the brain. It's called brain plasticity. Now, that's kind of the dark side of brain plasticity. It's adapted to something and it's made changes that led to a sound we don't want. But the good thing about brain plasticity is it can also try to reduce or undo those changes, but we need to know how to get it to do that, and that's what the sound therapy will do. We will work with the hearing clinic to have a person be assessed in terms of their hearing and their tinnitus and what it sounds like, and then our software will try to understand what these brain changes were and how can we embed the right kinds of sounds or ways of altering music so that as the person listens to it, that brain plasticity will try to reduce or undo some of those changes that are contributing to tinnitus. So the person basically gets assessed, so we know what their brain is like, and then they listen to the right kinds of sounds or music so that over time it can retrain the hearing brain and reduce the tinnitus.
So you are rewiring people's brains with this in the most wonderful way.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's exactly it.
How did you get started in this? What drew you to this area?
Well, I guess before even going to my education, I did have an uncle who was a car mechanic, and he was exposed to a lot of noise in the body shop. He obviously didn't wear hearing protection, and that's where the issue kind of started.
Yeah.
So because of that, not only did he damage his hearing, but he developed this constant high-pitched tone that he would always hear, and it was really disruptive in his life. But there really wasn't anything he could do about it. So I always kind of took that with me. We were very close, and I always remembered that kind of struggle. And when I was kind of determining where I would go in terms of research in the research field, I knew it would be related to the brain, but I came across a researcher at McMaster University who was focused on tinnitus, and I decided to join that lab, and that's where I completed my PhD, trying to understand kind of changes in the brain and how they're linked to tinnitus. And that's really kind of how I initially got into it and understanding it. And it was only after I finished my PhD, I used some of that knowledge and those ideas to think of, okay, we know how the brain is linked to tinnitus. Can we now try to make use of some of those mechanisms in the brain to reduce the tinnitus as well?
So when somebody comes in then, and you're saying you develop this sort of customized profile of what their auditory scope is, or their wiring of their brain, and what are you looking at as you develop? Because it's a customized therapy for each person, right?
Yes.
Can you walk me through those steps?
Yeah. So, everyone has their own kind of unique level of hearing or hearing loss. Not everyone with tinnitus has hearing loss, but most do. So first of all, when someone goes into a hearing clinic, we need to know, where there might be any hearing damage or hearing loss that maybe they got because they worked in a really noisy environment, or they were exposed to loud noise, or maybe just due to aging. As we age, we do start to lose our hearing gradually. And so we need to understand what that profile looks like, their hearing profile, because the brain will try to compensate. It's used to a certain level of input coming from the ears. And when we lose our hearing, it's going to try to compensate for that in some way. And in many cases, that can lead to tinnitus.
It sounds like a pesky toddler. Like if you don't give them the right toys, they're just going to make their own fun and start like tearing out the drywall or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that you wish would do things a little bit better, but unfortunately, while the brain is amazing, it can sometimes lead to some unwanted changes as well.
So once you develop this profile for them and you create the audio track, so it's different types of songs masked with the treatment underneath it to help the brain create these new pathways. So what is that like in treatment? You know, are you walking around with earbuds all day? Like how often, how long, and how much?
Yeah. So I guess to start, there is a commitment of sorts. We talked about rewiring or retraining the brain. That takes time. So, you know, with something like the sound therapy, what you're going to do is you will listen preferably through headphones. But you listen a total of about 2 hours a day. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't need to sit there and just listen and focus on it. You can be doing other things as long as you're not in a noisy environment. So, I mean, reading a book, working at a computer, taking a walk, they're all fine. And actually, the thing that probably makes it the most convenient for people is you can listen as you go to bed. And we know when we did our clinical study that people kept journals of how they used it. A lot of people listened as they did go to bed, and they'd end up falling asleep, and they still saw benefits. And so for many people, that's a convenient way to use this kind of sound therapy.
I love things that where you can sleep and just be a better human being. That sounds like right up my alley.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the truth is, a lot of people will find that as they're going to bed is when the tinnitus bothers them the most because it's really quiet, and the only thing they hear is the sound. So getting the sound therapy at that time is convenient for them as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yeah, in a nutshell, they will listen when it's convenient, but they will listen each day, hopefully. Mm-hmm. If they miss a day here or there, that's okay. And usually people will see benefits after about 3 to 6 months, and that'll be a reduction in the level of the tinnitus. It could be if people had disruptions in sleep, they've reported they have better sleep. Sometimes people have kind of a constant ringing or tinnitus, but maybe 4 or 5 days of the week it flares up and it gets a lot louder. Mm-hmm. So some of these people have said that they won't get as many of those flare-ups. They might get one a week or one every couple of weeks as opposed to getting them really frequently. Yeah. So different things like that can happen over time.
And so before this, what used to be the norm for any sort of success? Like what was out there for somebody? You'd mentioned before, you know, oftentimes these people who suffer from this go to their GP and the GP says, good luck. Yeah. What were the options before and how?
Yeah, because when we talk about the norm, that was definitely probably the norm before, and in some cases it probably still is. People will end up going to their GP first, and if the GP isn't aware of any options out there, then they will tell them that they're going to have to learn to live with it, to cope in some way. Mm-hmm. But other than that, there are a couple of paths. The GP may refer them to an ENT or an ear, nose, and throat doctor for some further testing, and sometimes there are things that they can pick up that the ENT might be able to deal with surgically. It's very rare, but there could be things like a growth that's kind of pushing on a nerve that leads into our brain, and it leads you to hear a sound. And if you can remove that, then you can kind of get rid of the tinnitus. But that is actually quite rare. Mm-hmm. So in most cases, in the past, if people were not told to live with it, they might seek out something like a masker. And a masker is still a sound, but it might be like a white noise or pink noise or some random tones, and you might get them in like a tabletop speaker, or in some cases it could have even been through a hearing aid that'll play it. And a masker is kind of self-explanatory. It works to cover up or mask the tinnitus. So while you would listen to it, it would cover it up, but then whenever you don't have it on, the tinnitus is still there. And so it's more of like a tool to try to cope throughout the day. Mm-hmm. But you know, depending on what you're using, especially if you don't have hearing loss, you know, listening for 8 to 10 hours a day to white noise isn't necessarily ideal either. So that was something that existed. And then the final thing is counseling. You know, we talked about the emotional aspect of tinnitus. Mm-hmm. So people have benefited from getting certain kinds of counseling programs. It could be cognitive behavioral therapy. Or it could be something called tinnitus retraining, where they are kind of counseled by someone that has received specific training on this, which unfortunately is not always easy to find a person like this.
That sounds very niche.
Yeah, and you'll go through that counseling to help you to, I guess, not be as affected by the sound and try to see it as more of a more neutral sound than before.
So you mentioned a couple of ways that people who suffer from tinnitus are finding relief, but a quick Google would tell me that there are a ton of solutions for tinnitus, and most of them end for only $19.95. So what else is out there, and what should buyer beware when they're seeing these promises?
Yeah, unfortunately, with tinnitus, you will find a lot of stuff online. That's, I guess, basically snake oil is the best way to describe it. And I would say, right off the bat, anything that calls itself a miracle cure, you should not really take seriously. You should probably avoid it because there might be some negative side effects that could come with it as well, depending on what it is.
Because some of them they're pills and drops, right? Like they're things you're putting into your body. It's not just putting a speaker on the table.
Yeah, exactly. And so unfortunately, yes, people have tried to sometimes market some things like that you will take or ingest to try to cure the tinnitus. And unfortunately, there is no cure at this time. I mean, even for sound options, we are trying to reduce it and make it more manageable. We never claim to eliminate it altogether. And so, that's one red flag. If you do see someone claiming that they have found a cure or cured this condition. The other thing you should always look at is, has there been any kind of clinical testing, a clinical trial related to this treatment? And that's important because what this clinical trial will show you is, there's been kind of a rigorous way to test, what the effect of this treatment is. Now, if you really want to dig deep, you should check whether this trial was a controlled trial, which basically means that the treatment was compared to something else. And that way you can kind of rule out whether it was just a placebo. So for example, if someone tells you, okay, I'm going to give you this thing and it's going to treat your tinnitus, for some people that might make them feel like that is helping, and it could be a temporary benefit, but maybe not in the long term. So a proper trial will also compare to make sure people know they might get a treatment, but they might not, and then really see what the benefit is. So that's something people can always try to investigate as well.
So you, with your background and your education, you took this clinical trial. What did you find?
Yeah, so what we did is we ran a clinical trial at McMaster University, and importantly, like I said, we did have a control group. I mentioned that our sound therapy is embedded in music, so I guess I can say that what this means is, in the end, it's still music, it's just been altered by our software. It's not as if you'll suddenly hear kind of tones in the music or random sounds. You'll still hear music, it's just been kind of reshaped by our software for your hearing system. Now, what we did in the trial is, you would know you'd get music, but what you didn't know is, was this music reshaped for you, or is this just regular music? And that way, because the person receiving it didn't know if they were getting a treatment, we could more properly check whether it's just the idea of listening to music, or whether it's this reshaped music by our software that's treating it. So what we ended up finding was people that listened to the regular music, they did not show any benefits over time, and we followed them over 12 months. Whereas the people that were listening to the altered music, they ended up seeing reductions in their tinnitus, usually after 3 months, sometimes after 6 months of listening. And
what kind of reductions?
So on average, it was a 40% reduction in people's tinnitus scores that they would
significant.
See. Yeah, it's definitely significant. It's something that makes a meaningful difference for people, especially if they have severe tinnitus.
So I have a very serious question. Is this elevator music that we're listening to?
It's not elevator music, so people get a choice of different types.
What are my choices?
So usually it'll be a collection of classical music that we've tested, or another one is kind of like a relaxation or spa type music. So they'll both be instrumental. It makes it a little easier to put into your life as you're maybe trying to work or things like that.
So not a death metal option at this point, nothing of that. Our crew is disappointed.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve. Unfortunately, that's probably something that can cause tinnitus for many people. And so, we haven't found a way to work that into a treatment yet.
So somebody who, this is their life, and it's, and as you said, it can really affect the quality of your life. What are their options? Because, some of these people are bouncing in and out of GPs. So if you have this, if you've run into roadblocks before, what are the next steps? What should people be doing?
So if you have gone to a GP and maybe they haven't been able to offer you anything, then I can say that there are some hearing clinics that offer solutions, obviously through Sound Options. In Canada alone, we have probably over 300 clinics that work with us across Canada. You can always go on our Sound Options website to look them up. They're listed there.
And we'll put that in the show notes as well. Yeah.
So those clinics have been trained to help kind of tinnitus sufferers, provide them with information, and also offer them our treatment. That's something that people can definitely do. They can always do their research and look on kind of what kind of options we offer and what we've done to validate them. And I really think that's a good place to start for people, to find the right kinds of healthcare professionals and the ones that actually do offer something for tinnitus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they have recently developed tinnitus and they haven't seen their GP yet, I'd still say it can be a good idea to do so. It really depends. If you have been exposed to really loud noise and you ended up with permanent tinnitus after that, then it's probably, you might not necessarily get much from the GP besides them sending you to a hearing clinic.
Mm-hmm.
But if it kind of developed and you don't really know the cause, then that's still a good place to start. They may end up sending you to an ENT.
Can you go directly to a hearing clinic?
Absolutely.
Or do you, okay.
You do not need a referral. You can call them and make an appointment. Let them know that you have tinnitus and it's something you'd like them to look at. Now, of course, you want to find out if they offer anything for it, and then that way they will know to take that into account. So yeah, you don't need a referral for a hearing healthcare clinic.
So any other tips for somebody, like if you knew what you knew now and your uncle was coming up against this early, or later on in his path, and you know what you know now, what would you tell him? What would, beyond, here, I've got something for you.
So I guess there are a few things I would say. I mean, first of all, 400 to 500 that people would pay in the clinic, and that will cover all the assessments and the treatment itself.
What's it like for you when you get those testimonials from people, when you first came out of that clinical trial, you had a good sense that this was working for people, but when you actually started hearing the stories and the change in people's lives, can you give me an example of something that's really stuck with you?
Yeah, I recently spoke with a lady whose husband had very severe tinnitus, and it was really affecting his life, kind of to the extent we talked about depression and anxiety, and she could see him suffering with it, and not only was it really impacting him, it was impacting her, obviously, to see that kind of suffering in her husband. So he had been using the sound therapy for a couple of months, and she said that it already had a significant impact on the level of the sound. So I guess before he would describe it as unbearable, whereas now it was still there, but it was getting more manageable, and that had like a tremendous impact on just his ability to enjoy his life and I guess kind of find happiness in life as well. So obviously it meant the world to her. And hearing from her, that's something that's very important to me. I mean, I did get into this field because I want to be able to help people who traditionally haven't necessarily been helped or have been neglected to some extent. And to hear those kinds of stories, I mean, obviously any kind of improvement is great, and I'm happy to hear about it, but hearing stories of its kind of profound effect on someone's life, it really helps kind of drive my passion to continue and even try to work out new ways to try to improve treatments in the future, and just to keep going to help these people.
So when you were talking about, neuroplasticity is people are having much more of an awareness of the potential for this, and you have created something that has such a tangible effect. Is your brain must be smoking on other applications or other ways that this might be, this sort of potential for rewiring could help in other things. Are there other avenues you're interested in exploring?
Yeah, in the future, I think there are different aspects that people may benefit from with the sound therapy that's tailored to them and what they hear. There are a lot of people with sleep issues and sleep disorder issues, and there's been some research showing that sound therapies, and maybe the right kind of sound therapies, can provide them with some help. And obviously sleep deprivation can have a range of impacts on a person's life beyond just a night of sleep. So that's the direction we may look at in the future, to see if we can develop something to help people in those cases. And then beyond, one of the reasons we use music in the sound therapy is because music can have like a relaxing effect on people. And with many things, and with tinnitus as well, the part of our brain that processes emotion, stress, it's actually linked to the hearing system. That's one reason some people might get worse tinnitus when they are feeling stressed. So if you can use music and embed a sound therapy into it, you might be addressing the hearing system, but also that part of our brain that deals with kind of emotion, and
is soothing as the sound
so
therapy.
So you can try to use that as well for tinnitus, but that also might have some other benefits, in the future for other conditions where you might want to provide that kind of relaxation for people.
Well, that is amazing. Not only do I know I can say either tinnitus or tinnitus, but you've really brought to light an incredible option for people suffering from this. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been great talking to you about this.